Hi, I'm Steve Smith.
And I'm Elspeth Jones. And we're going to talk today about the new book that's just come out called Memory, What Every Language Teacher Should Know. Now, Steve, you've been working with Gianfranco Conti for some time. This is your third book together. I've had the pleasure of editing all three of those. And this one I found particularly interesting because people may not be aware I'm a former EFL teacher. And so I found it especially interesting. In fact, some of the people that you've quoted in the book, Rod Ellis, my former head of department, Peter Skian, my master's teacher, it's all very interesting to come back to these things after a long time away. So I really enjoyed editing the book. I hope people enjoy reading it. But first of all, and let's talk about what people can find in the book, what they might find interesting. First of all, you say that language learning is very different from other forms of learning, so perhaps you could just talk about that for a minute.
Well, there have been quite a few books published in recent years about cognitive science for teachers in general, but up to now there's been nothing specifically for language teachers, and both Gianfranco and I felt that there was a need for language teachers to know a bit more about how memory works, because if we want to understand how pupils learn, it helps to understand how their memories work, how we can stop them forgetting stuff.
And this book, compared to the previous two, it took a long time to write because you had to do a lot of research. And I think my sense is that the two previous books were much more from your personal experiences, both of you, with research backed up to back it up. But this one, you really spent a lot of time looking into the whole idea of cognitive science. And one thing in particular was of interest, which is the idea of cognitive load. So how important is that in the classroom?
Well, a fellow called Dylan William once tweeted that cognitive load is the most important thing that teachers should know about. And I guess for us as language teachers, it comes into play particularly when we're talking about input of language and how it's important at every stage that students understand what we tell them and that we don't overload them with too much information, too much language at once, because once human brains get overloaded, then they can't rehearse enough material in their working memories for it to go into long-term memory. And one of the sort of themes of the book is that what we're aiming for with students is for language to pass into long-term memory. So every skill that we can use as teachers to release language of the right level and the right level of comprehensibility, the more chance there is for memories to develop.
And then the idea of working memory and long-term memory is very, I found that very interesting. So what do we mean by working memory?
Well, an analogy I use in the book, which has been on my mind recently in lockdown, as we've been doing a lot of cooking together, is that when you look at a recipe and you get the information from the recipe and then you go to somewhere else in the kitchen and you start to try and carry out that instruction, you quickly forget it and you have to keep going back to the recipe book, don't you? And this can happen multiple times. And what's happening is that some information you've taken into memory is held there consciously and then quickly disappears. Mm-hmm. So this short-term memory is what psychologists usually refer to as working memory. And so when we're learning language and we're getting input, everything immediately is being processed by working memory. So if we understand how working memory functions, then there's more chance of that language then being practiced, rehearsed in the mind, and then eventually becoming part of long-term memory. So we provide lots of examples in the book of how we can help pupils rehearse language. I mean, a classic example is one we've talked about before called delayed dictation. Where you read a sentence to a class, but instead of them writing it down straight away, you force them to rehearse it in their mind several times, say over 10 seconds, before they write it down. So by encouraging this process of rehearsal in working memory, we can help memories to stick and to eventually become long-term memory. So this relationship between working memory and long-term memory, it's a very dynamic, complex relationship, which is probably oversimplified in the models from cognitive psychology. But we need to understand that in classrooms especially, a lot is happening in working memory, and whatever we can do to make it function more efficiently, the better the learning outcomes will be.
And another example, I mean, it's I was picking up things as I was doing the editing process. And one of the things I noticed is in the book, you talk about getting pupils to concentrate on specific things. So when they're looking at things that they've written, to really look at individual specific things. So when I was editing the book, I realized that, I went through so many times, I had to just focus on one thing at a time. So if I was looking at, what do the bullet points look like, I just concentrated on those. And I hadn't really thought about it before, but I found it really interesting. So I think there are messages for life in general in the book as well. But moving on, you talk about comprehensible input a lot, and we've had many conversations about this over the years, but why do you talk about it so much in this book?
Well, this phrase, which to non-teachers sounds like jargon, comprehensible input, what does it mean? It simply means that messages that people can understand, whether they're messages that you hear or messages that you read. And in one view of things, essentially how we learn language is simply by understanding messages. And if we understand messages, then the brain does its job naturally. We learn and we remember. Most researchers these days think that's a slight oversimplification, perhaps a significant oversimplification, but nevertheless, receiving messages you understand is fundamental to learning. And what can often go wrong in language classrooms is that when the target language is being used a lot, it's not always understood, and it's easy to overestimate how much students will understand. So anything we can do to make the language comprehensible is going to reduce cognitive load, is going to make pupils feel happier, give them a sense of achievement and understanding, allow them to understand what's happening, make them feel better, which in turn is good for memory, because we know that anxiety inhibits learning, and that if you're a relaxed, happy learner, then you will remember more.
I wish I'd read this book before I was a teacher myself, actually. It would have been really helpful. You talk also about motivational factors and emotional factors. What role do they have to play?
Well, it's been said that for successful language learning, you need a combination of aptitude and motivation. They're the two things. I mean, if someone's not motivated to learn, whatever you do in the classroom is not going to make a huge amount of difference. So there are lots and lots of theories about motivation, and although we don't go into this in much depth in the book, one of the key ones is the idea of self-efficacy. This is an idea from Albert Bandura, which suggests that we are motivated to do something when we feel confident at doing it, when we know we've mastered it and we're confident in our own ability to perform. And for me, as a classroom teacher, this always seemed to me to be the key to success. Motivation is not generated by the idea of, let's say, having a good job one day or going on holiday. Generally, for students in class, it's to do with how good am I at this subject? Do I enjoy it? Can I do it well? And if you've got that in place, then you've got the start of being able to create the conditions for memories to become established. You've got to have motivation to start with.
And speaking of memories, you talk about declarative and procedural memory, which I must say I struggled with for a while, but then, the examples come through in the book. But can you say something about that?
Well, when we talk about declarative memory or explicit knowledge, we're talking about, in language terms, being able to describe the language, being able to say, for example, that adjectives agree with gender, or these are the endings of a certain verb. That's describing the language, that's knowing something about the language. For example, knowing that the capital of Spain is Madrid. On the other hand, you've got something that the psychologists call procedural knowledge, which is actually knowing how to do something. And for us as language teachers, that's what we really want students to do in the end. Can they actually use and understand the language, not talk about it? And therefore, it's easy for language teachers who are very keen on grammar and linguistics and so on to spend perhaps too much time, can happen, talking about the language rather than creating activities which generate use and comprehension of the language. So the more we can do to generate language use and communication, the more likely that language will pass into long-term memory. That's both the knowledge of vocabulary and the knowledge of the system of the language, its grammar.
Well, as I said, I found it really fascinating editing the book. It was a lot of hard work for you and for Gianfranco, but you said that this is only part 1 of 2. So you've led on this book around memory, and there's another one going to follow, I think.
Yeah, originally we thought we'd do one quite concise book talking about cognitive science and then the development of skills and fluency, but we soon discovered that there was far too much material to work with. So in the end, we've written a fairly chunky book about memory, as it happens in the end, but haven't gone into much detail about skill acquisition and developing fluency. So Gianfranco's going to take the lead on that particular book, as I've taken the lead on this one. So perhaps in a few months or a year, we'll see the fruits of that research.
I remember when we first talked about this, and you said you were going to do a book on cognitive science for language teachers, and I thought, okay. But actually, I really like the way it meshes the cognitive science and the second language acquisition research, and I think it's really interesting, and I hope people are going to enjoy reading it.
Well, thank you. And I think the things I want teachers to take away, that this book should be interesting, it should be informative, and it should be useful. And I hope readers find that that's the case.